Chapter 7 of our text deals with listening, receiving, and responding to messages. The chapter is made up of 4 segments. The first is the nature of listening. The second is the challenge of listening. The third is components of listening. And the fourth is types of listening responses. All right, let's jump into the very first, and that is the nature of listening. Think about how others view you as a listener. Do they view you as a good listener? Do you take into account what they say? Are you more judgmental in your listening style? Are you more relational? Well, let's look at it. The importance of listening. Certainly, listening is important. And research says that as much as 55% of a college student's communication time is spent listening. Even in committed relationships, listening to personal information in everyday conversations is considered a very important ingredient to marital satisfaction. Well, let's define listening. Listening may be defined as the process of receiving and responding to others' messages. Traditional approaches to listening focus on the reception of spoken messages. And of course, in our time, a lot of listening and speaking takes place through mediated channels. So think of a time when you said something like this: I was talking with a friend and he said. Well, you weren't physically talking, but you were texting that person. And so sometimes we use the language of talking and listening to refer to mediated communication itself. There is a difference between hearing and listening. They're not identical. Hearing is the process in which sound waves strike the eardrum, cause vibrations that are transmitted to the brain. Listening now occurs when the brain reconstructs these impulses, these vibrations, into the original sound, and then it gives them meaning. Notice the last section. It gives them meaning. Listening, however, isn't automatic. Many times we hear, but we don't listen. So there are 2 types of listening. One is mindless listening, and this occurs when we react to others' messages automatically and routinely without much thought, without mental investment. It sort of sounds negative, but this sort of low-level information processing is really a valuable type of communication. It kind of frees our minds to focus on messages that require careful attention. Given the number of messages that we expose to, it really is impractical to listen carefully and mindfully to all of it. The only realistic way to manage the barrage of messages is to be lazy towards some of them. Mindful listening, on the other hand, gives careful and thoughtful attention and responses to the messages we receive. Sometimes we respond mindlessly to information that deserves and even demands our mindful attention, and that usually creates problems. Listening styles. Not everyone listens the same way or with the same goals all the time. There are basically 4 broad listening styles that have been identified. The first is task-oriented, the second is relational, the third is analytical, and the fourth is critical. And of course, each of these has some strengths and some weaknesses. The key to it is using more than one listening style, depending on the situation and the relationship. So take both into account, the situation at hand and the relationship concerned. Let's start with the first, and that is task-oriented listening. Here, listening is most concerned with efficiency and accomplishing the job at hand. Tell me what I need to do in as few words as possible, and I'll go ahead and do it. Despite its advantages, a task orientation may alienate others when it seems to ignore their feelings. So people with a different temperament, who are not as task-oriented, or those who are from a different culture, may find it impolite to be that direct and frank. And they may not appreciate a strictly task-oriented approach. So task-oriented listeners minimize the emotional impact and issues and concerns, and they focus on the task at hand. Second is relational listening. And this is most concerned with building emotional closeness with others. People who use this style are typically extroverted, attentive, and friendly. They strive to be non-judgmental and are far more interested in understanding your point of view and supporting you rather than evaluating or even controlling. Relational listeners are more likely than those with other styles to draw out responses from the message sender. So this makes them comfortable. The style of listening makes them comfortable so that they're able to disclose even more. Be sure to take the listening style assessment in the textbook. The problem with relational listening, this type of orientation to listening, is that in an effort to be friendly and supportive, relational listeners kind of lose their detachment and ability to be objective in the way they assess information. And of course, those who are far more task-oriented in their communication style and listening style may view them as kind of overly expressive and almost intrusive. Analytical listening emphasizes attending to the full message before coming to judgment. And people who default to this style want to hear the details, analyze the issue from a variety of perspectives. They are a big help when the goal is to investigate difficult questions, taking into account a wide range of perspectives. But it is time-consuming and impractical at times, especially when a deadline is approaching. Critical listening is for those who have a strong desire to evaluate messages. There's somewhat a fine line between analytical listening and critical listening. They are concerned not just with understanding messages, but with assessing their quality and focusing on accuracy and consistency. The problem with critical listeners is that they can frustrate you by appearing to find fault even in the smallest details. Whatever style you find yourself to be, it's important to recognize that you can control the way you're listening. So you can listen critically, you can listen analytically, you can listen relationally, and you can listen in a task-oriented fashion. It all depends on the situation and depends on the relationship that is involved. All right, we'll stop right there.